The bridal brunch at the Grand Willow estate looked like something taken from the pages of a luxury magazine. Sunlight streamed through towering glass windows and reflected off crystal glasses arranged neatly along white linen tables. The scent of fresh roses and vanilla pastries floated through the room as soft music played in the background. Dozens of well-dressed guests chatted comfortably, laughing over champagne and carefully plated desserts. Almost everyone there belonged to the same polished world, a world of country clubs, charity galas, and effortless wealth. Among them sat Eleanor Hart, quietly folding her hands in her lap while observing the celebration around her. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a pale lavender dress she had saved months to buy. It was simple, modest compared to the designer outfits worn by the other guests, but she had hoped it would help her blend in, at least for her son's sake. At the center of the room sat the bride-to-be, Victoria Langley, glowing in a silk cream dress as she opened an endless stream of gifts. Her friends surrounded her, passing boxes, snapping photos, and commenting excitedly about every item. Victoria's mother, Margaret Langley, watched proudly nearby, occasionally directing the flow of the event like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Eleanor had arrived early, bringing a carefully wrapped velvet box that she had kept hidden for years. Inside were a pair of antique sapphire earrings that had belonged to her own mother, heirlooms worn at 2 weddings before this one. Eleanor had imagined the moment when Victoria would open the gift and understand its meaning, a symbol of welcome into the family. When the small box finally made its way to the bride, Victoria opened it quickly, barely pausing before holding up the earrings under the light. "Oh, vintage," she said politely, forcing a brief smile before placing them back in the box. "Very classic." The group of friends around her murmured polite compliments before quickly moving on to the next elaborate gift: diamond bracelets, designer handbags, luxury spa packages. Within seconds, the heirloom was forgotten among torn wrapping paper. 2 hours later, Eleanor quietly slipped away toward the hallway bathroom, needing a moment away from the noise. She stared at her reflection while washing her hands, noticing the fatigue in her eyes and the faint tremble in her fingers. Just as she turned to leave, the door opened again. Victoria and her maid of honor, Camille, entered mid-conversation, not realizing Eleanor was still standing near the mirror. Eleanor instinctively stepped into the corner stall, not wanting to interrupt them. Their voices echoed clearly in the small tiled room. "Is she still here?" Victoria asked with irritation. Camille laughed softly. "Of course she is. Did she notice the sticker yet?" The 2 women burst into quiet giggles. Eleanor felt a strange chill crawl down her spine. "Honestly, it's perfect," Camille continued. "No one even questions it. Everyone just assumes it's part of the game."
Victoria sighed dramatically.
"Oliver feels guilty about her all the time. It's exhausting. She's always needing something." Eleanor's stomach tightened as she slowly reached behind her back, fingers brushing against a small piece of paper stuck to her dress. Carefully peeling it off, she turned it around. Written in bold black letters was a single word: Leech. Victoria's voice continued from outside the stall. "Oliver says she sold her house because she couldn't manage anymore," Victoria said dismissively. "Honestly, she probably expects us to take care of her forever." Camille replied, "You should set boundaries once you're married. Otherwise, she'll drain you." Eleanor stood frozen, staring down at the sticker in her trembling hands. What neither of them knew was that Eleanor had sold her house for a very different reason. 6 months earlier, Oliver had sat at her kitchen table with tears in his eyes. Victoria wanted a wedding at the prestigious Grand Willow estate, a venue that cost more than Oliver earned in an entire year. He had been desperate, ashamed that he couldn't provide the kind of celebration Victoria's wealthy family expected. Eleanor had listened quietly before making a decision she never told anyone about. The next week, she signed the papers selling the small home where she had raised Oliver after his father died. The money from that sale, nearly $200,000, had been handed to her son as an early inheritance. Oliver believed it came from long-term savings. Eleanor had never corrected him. Now she lived in a modest apartment across town, working part-time at a bookstore at 65 years old to stretch what remained of her retirement funds. All so Oliver could stand proudly beside the woman he loved without feeling small. Eleanor folded the sticker slowly and slipped it into her purse before leaving the bathroom without a word. Victoria and Camille fell silent as she passed them in the hallway. Their expressions flickered with brief panic before returning to polite smiles. Eleanor simply nodded, collected her handbag from the table, thanked the hostess for the invitation, and quietly left the estate. Outside, the late afternoon air felt cooler than she expected. Sitting in her car, she allowed the tears to finally fall. Her phone buzzed moments later with a message from Oliver. "How's the brunch going? Did Victoria like your gift?" Eleanor stared at the screen for a long time before locking the phone without replying. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every mile carried memories she had buried for decades, memories of raising Oliver alone after his father, Daniel, died suddenly when Oliver was only 11 years old. Back then, Eleanor had promised herself that her son would never feel limited by the hardships they faced. She worked 2 jobs, often grading school papers late into the night after finishing bookkeeping work for small businesses. When Oliver was accepted to Westbrook University, she secretly sold the last pieces of jewelry left from her mother's estate to cover tuition deposits. When he needed a car for his internship, she refinanced the house without telling him. Each sacrifice had been invisible, quietly absorbed into the background of his life. Watching him succeed had always been enough. Until now. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her small apartment, the folded yellow sticker resting on the table beside her untouched dinner. For the first time in years, she wondered if silence had been a mistake. Perhaps love that remained unseen could easily be misunderstood. Outside her window, the city lights flickered on one by one, but Eleanor barely noticed them. Her thoughts lingered on the conversation she had overheard and the quiet certainty growing inside her chest. Something deeper was happening beneath the surface of this wedding. Something far more deliberate than simple cruelty. And for the first time, Eleanor began to question whether her son truly understood the cost of the life he was about to begin. Long before the elegant halls of the Grand Willow estate and the whispering conversations of Victoria's social circle, Eleanor Hart had lived a very different life. Years earlier, the modest brick house on Linden Street had been filled with laughter, cluttered schoolbooks, and the comforting smell of Daniel Hart's morning coffee. It wasn't a large home, but it had been built carefully over time through patience, long work hours, and the quiet partnership between Eleanor and her husband. Daniel worked as an electrician who often took extra shifts to keep the household stable, while Eleanor taught history at the local middle school. Their lives were simple, steady, and deeply connected to their only son, Oliver. Every Sunday they would eat dinner together at the old oak table Daniel had built himself, talking about school assignments, future plans, and whatever odd stories Oliver had brought home from the playground. Those evenings felt ordinary then, but in later years Eleanor would remember them as the most precious moments of her life. The stability of that life ended quickly when Daniel fell ill. What began as constant fatigue slowly turned into hospital visits, treatments, and long nights of uncertainty. The diagnosis came suddenly, an aggressive illness that doctors admitted had already progressed too far. Within months, Eleanor found herself standing beside a hospital bed while Oliver, only 11 years old, struggled to understand how the strong father who used to carry him on his shoulders could suddenly look so fragile. Daniel tried to remain cheerful for his son's sake, often joking about how Oliver would soon be taller than both of his parents. But Eleanor could see the fear hidden beneath those smiles. The night Daniel passed away, Oliver sat silently beside his mother on the hospital bench, his small hands gripping hers tightly as if letting go might cause the world to collapse entirely. In that moment, Eleanor made a promise she would never speak aloud. Oliver's life would never shrink because of this loss. No matter what it required, she would make sure he had every opportunity possible. The years that followed tested that promise daily. The mortgage payments remained, the grocery bills continued to arrive, and the responsibilities of raising a growing boy alone seemed endless. Eleanor accepted additional evening work managing accounts for several small businesses around town. Her schedule quickly became a careful balancing act, teaching during the day, bookkeeping late into the evening, and helping Oliver with homework whenever she could find the time. Many nights, she would fall asleep grading assignments at the kitchen table only to wake up hours later with a blanket draped gently over her shoulders, placed there by Oliver before he went to bed. Even as a teenager, he understood that his mother was carrying more than she let on. Despite the financial strain, Oliver flourished. He proved to be a thoughtful and determined student, often staying after school for science clubs and academic competitions. Teachers praised his work ethic, noting how seriously he took every assignment. Eleanor attended every awards ceremony and school event she could, sitting proudly in the audience even when exhaustion threatened to pull her eyelids closed. Watching Oliver walk across stages to accept scholarships and certificates felt like small confirmations that the long nights and quiet sacrifices were worth it. When the acceptance letter from Westbrook University finally arrived, Oliver ran into the house waving the envelope with disbelief written across his face. Eleanor hugged him tightly, hiding the wave of anxiety that followed almost immediately. Tuition deposits and housing costs were far beyond what she had saved. Within a week, Eleanor visited a jeweler in the city, carrying a small velvet pouch that had remained hidden in her dresser drawer for years. Inside were pieces of jewelry inherited from her mother and grandmother, items she had always imagined passing down one day. The jeweler examined them carefully before naming a price that would cover Oliver's first-year expenses. Eleanor agreed, without hesitation. She told Oliver later that evening that a scholarship program had helped with the deposit. The pride and relief on his face made the life feel like the easiest decision she had ever made. College transformed Oliver's world. Westbrook introduced him to students from families far wealthier and more connected than anything he had experienced growing up. At first, he struggled with the contrast between his modest upbringing and the effortless confidence of classmates who discussed international vacations and investment portfolios as casually as weekend plans. Yet Oliver adapted quickly, earning respect through intelligence and dedication. During his final year, he met Victoria Langley at a campus networking event hosted by her father's company. Victoria was charismatic, ambitious, and surrounded by an aura of privilege that fascinated many students. She had grown up traveling between luxury homes and private schools, and she carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Oliver was captivated almost immediately. Victoria spoke about future business expansions and international opportunities with enthusiasm, and Oliver admired her confidence. Their relationship developed quickly, built on shared ambitions and Victoria's excitement about the possibilities ahead. When Oliver first told his mother about her during a phone call, Eleanor listened carefully as he described Victoria's intelligence and her family's success. Beneath his excitement, she sensed a faint nervousness, as if he feared not measuring up to the standards of Victoria's world. Eleanor reassured him gently, reminding him that character mattered far more than wealth. Still, she understood that love often carried its own pressures. Several months later, Oliver visited her with news that he planned to propose. His excitement was mixed with clear anxiety about the expectations surrounding the engagement ring. Victoria's friends often shared photographs online displaying large diamonds and elaborate proposals. Oliver confessed that he had been saving money, but still worried it would not be enough. Eleanor responded with calm encouragement and quietly revisited the jeweler once again, selling the final heirloom pieces she had left. The check she handed Oliver days later was presented simply as family savings. Oliver protested at first, but eventually accepted after Eleanor insisted it was meant for his future. Victoria adored the ring. Photos appeared across social media showcasing the sparkling diamond as friends congratulated the couple. In every image, Victoria's smile shone brightly while Oliver stood proudly beside her. Eleanor watched those photos from her small living room, feeling both happiness and a quiet ache she could not fully explain. She reminded herself repeatedly that sacrifices were natural for parents who loved their children. Wedding planning soon followed the engagement, and the scale of the celebration expanded rapidly under Victoria's vision. Her family's connections opened doors to exclusive venues, luxury vendors, and elaborate guest lists filled with business associates and influential friends. Oliver initially attempted to manage the costs carefully, but each conversation about budgets seemed to end with the same conclusion. Certain elements simply couldn't be compromised. When the discussion about hosting the ceremony at the Grand Willow estate arose, Oliver appeared deeply conflicted. The venue represented exactly the kind of statement Victoria's parents expected for their daughter's wedding, but the cost alone exceeded Oliver's entire annual salary. One evening, Oliver visited Eleanor, looking defeated. He admitted that he feared disappointing Victoria and her family if he couldn't meet their expectations. Eleanor listened quietly while he spoke, remembering the promise she had made years earlier in the hospital hallway. The next morning, she contacted a real estate agent to begin the process of selling the Linden Street house. Signing the final paperwork weeks later felt surreal. That home contained decades of memories: birthdays, school mornings, quiet dinners after long workdays. Yet when she handed Oliver the check and told him it was his inheritance arriving a little early, she saw relief flood across his face. He asked several times if she was sure about the decision. Eleanor only smiled and reminded him that his father would have wanted him to be happy. Oliver never learned that his mother moved into a small one-bedroom apartment afterward, or that she had begun working part-time at a neighborhood bookstore to help stretch what remained of her savings. She made certain her phone calls sounded cheerful and that her visits always included warm encouragement about the wedding plans. From Oliver's perspective, everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as it should. Only Eleanor knew how many invisible threads had been woven quietly beneath the surface to hold that future together. As the wedding date approached, the preparations grew more elaborate with each passing week. Victoria's parents seemed to take charge of nearly every detail, transforming what had originally been a simple celebration into a grand social event. Meetings with caterers, designers, and planners filled the calendar. Invitations were printed on heavy embossed paper, the guest list expanding to include business partners, investors, and distant relatives whose names Oliver barely recognized. The wedding had slowly become more than a union between two people. It was a display of prestige for the Langley family. Eleanor watched the process from the sidelines. At first, she assumed the distance was simply a matter of logistics. Victoria's parents were wealthy and well-connected, after all, and they naturally had relationships with high-end vendors who handled these kinds of events regularly. Eleanor told herself there was no reason to feel offended when she wasn't invited to the early planning meetings. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. Whenever Oliver mentioned an upcoming tasting, rehearsal discussion, or venue visit, the explanation was always the same. "There's just limited space, Mom." Or sometimes, Victoria's parents already arranged everything with their friends. Eleanor responded with polite understanding each time, careful to keep any disappointment hidden. She didn't want Oliver to feel pressured or guilty. If excluding her from these events made things easier for him, she would accept it. Still, small details began to accumulate in ways that felt impossible to dismiss. One afternoon, Oliver called while Eleanor was shelving books at the store. His voice sounded hesitant. "Mom, Victoria thinks it might be better if you skip the cake tasting this weekend," he explained. "Her aunt is a professional chef and she's helping with the menu. They only reserved seats for a few people." Eleanor paused, holding a stack of novels against her chest. "Of course," she replied gently. "I wouldn't want to get in the way." But after hanging up, she remained standing in the aisle for several minutes, staring at the rows of books without really seeing them. The cake tasting was only the beginning. A week later, Oliver mentioned that Victoria's family had organized a walkthrough at the Grand Willow estate to finalize the reception layout. Eleanor learned about it only after the meeting had already happened. Another time, Oliver briefly referred to a dinner with a florist and decorator to review design samples. Once again, Eleanor had not been invited. Each time she told herself the same thing. It wasn't personal. Victoria's family simply had more experience with these kinds of events. But even Oliver's behavior had begun to change subtly. He seemed distracted during their conversations, often checking his phone while they spoke. Whenever Eleanor asked questions about the wedding, his answers were brief, almost hurried. The distance between them was growing, and neither of them quite knew how to address it. The issue became impossible to ignore when the seating chart discussion surfaced. Oliver visited Eleanor's apartment one evening carrying a folder filled with printed layouts of the reception hall. The excitement that had once filled his voice when discussing the wedding was noticeably absent now. "Mom, there's something I need to explain," he said carefully, while sitting on the edge of her couch. Eleanor already sensed what was coming. "The head table is limited," Oliver continued. "Victoria's parents want to include some important clients who are traveling in from overseas." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And Victoria thinks it might be better if you sit with some of her relatives instead," Oliver added. "They're very nice people. You'll enjoy them." There was a brief silence in the room. Eleanor looked down at the floor before responding. "That sounds fine," she said quietly. Oliver seemed relieved by her calm reaction. But what he didn't notice was the subtle shift in her expression, the moment when understanding settled into place. She would not be sitting with her own son at his wedding reception. The weeks continued to move forward. 2 months before the ceremony, Oliver brought another piece of news during a quick dinner visit. "Victoria and I are thinking about moving after the wedding," he said while scrolling through messages on his phone. Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Moving where?" "Denver," Oliver replied casually. "Her father's company is expanding operations there. Victoria might lead the new office." The information struck Eleanor like a sudden gust of cold air. "Denver," she repeated softly. "It's a great opportunity," Oliver continued. "Fresh start, bigger projects. Victoria's father already found an amazing condo downtown." Eleanor forced a supportive smile. "That sounds exciting." But later that week she ran into someone who unknowingly revealed a different version of the story. At the grocery store, Eleanor encountered Patricia, a neighbor who had known Oliver since childhood. Patricia greeted her warmly, asking about the upcoming wedding. Then, during the conversation, Patricia casually mentioned something unexpected. "I heard Oliver and Victoria are moving to Denver," she said. Victoria was talking about it months ago at her birthday party. She seemed confident Oliver would eventually agree. Eleanor felt a faint tightening in her chest. "Months ago?" she asked carefully. "Yes," Patricia replied. "Her father apparently secured the condo early this year." Eleanor smiled politely and finished the conversation, but the timeline lingered in her thoughts. Oliver had presented the move as a recent idea. Yet Victoria had apparently been planning it long before Eleanor even knew it was being considered. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment staring at the single-framed photograph on her shelf, a picture taken at Oliver's college graduation. His arm rested proudly around her shoulders as they both smiled at the camera. The more she reflected on recent events, the clearer the pattern became. Victoria hadn't been openly hostile. Instead, she had been quietly strategic. Invitations that never arrived. Decisions made without Eleanor's knowledge. Plans discussed months before Oliver mentioned them. And now a move across the country. Individually, each situation could be explained away. But together they formed something far more deliberate. It was as though Victoria was slowly redrawing the boundaries of Oliver's life, a life where his mother occupied less and less space. Eleanor felt a wave of sadness she had never expected. Not anger, not resentment, just the quiet realization that she might be losing the person she had spent her entire life protecting. Still, she refused to create conflict.
Oliver loved Victoria.
And Eleanor had always believed that love required patience. But 2 weeks before the wedding, something finally pushed her to speak. She called Oliver and asked if they could meet for coffee.
It was a small request.
A simple conversation between a mother and her son. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the meeting would change everything. Because for the first time since the wedding planning began, she intended to tell Oliver the truth about what she had overheard at the bridal brunch. And deep down, she feared the truth might not bring them closer. It might drive them even further apart. The cafe Oliver chose for the meeting was small and quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a florist on Maple Avenue. It was the kind of place Eleanor liked. Warm lighting, soft music, and the comforting smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. She arrived early and chose a table by the window, folding her hands together while watching people pass outside on the sidewalk. When Oliver walked in a few minutes later, he looked different from how she remembered him even a few months earlier. His shoulders were tense, his smile forced, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that hadn't been there before. Wedding planning had clearly taken its toll. "Sorry I'm late," he said as he slid into the chair across from her, placing his phone on the table. "Things have been a little crazy lately." Eleanor nodded with understanding. "I can imagine." A waitress arrived and took their drink orders before leaving them alone again. For a moment neither of them spoke. Oliver tapped his fingers lightly against the table while glancing at his phone screen. The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor finally realized something important. If she didn't begin the conversation now, she might lose the courage to do it at all. "Oliver," she said gently. He looked up. "There's something I need to tell you." Before he could respond, his phone vibrated against the table. Oliver glanced down quickly. "It's Victoria," he said. "She's asking about the florist delivery." "Please," Eleanor said softly but firmly. "Just 5 minutes." Oliver hesitated, then turned the phone face down. "Okay," he said. "What's going on?" Eleanor inhaled slowly. "The bridal brunch," she began. "Something happened there." Oliver frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Eleanor described the bathroom conversation she had overheard. Victoria and Camille laughing about the sticker, the word written on it, and the accusations that Eleanor was a financial burden who constantly asked for money. She spoke calmly, carefully choosing her words so the story sounded factual rather than emotional. Oliver's expression changed as she spoke. At first he looked confused, then defensive. "That doesn't sound like Victoria," he said quickly when Eleanor finished. "I'm only telling you what I heard." "There must be some misunderstanding," Oliver insisted. "Victoria wouldn't do something like that." Eleanor remained calm. "I saw the sticker myself." Oliver shook his head.
No.
"Someone else must have done it as a joke. Maybe one of her friends. But Victoria wouldn't say those things about you." Eleanor felt a familiar ache in her chest but continued. "Oliver, I also heard her telling Camille that I sold my house because I couldn't manage financially." "Well, you did sell the house," Oliver replied cautiously. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "but not for the reasons she thinks." Oliver leaned back slightly. "What do you mean?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before answering. "I sold it because of the wedding." The words hung between them. Oliver stared at her. "What?" "You came to me 6 months ago worried you couldn't afford the venue Victoria wanted," Eleanor explained. "The Grand Willow estate." Oliver blinked. "That money I gave you," she continued softly. "The one I called your early inheritance. It came from selling the house." For several seconds Oliver didn't respond. Then he laughed slightly, shaking his head. "Mom, that doesn't make sense." "It's the truth." "You told me you were downsizing," he replied. "That the house was too big for just you. I didn't want you to feel guilty." Oliver leaned forward, his voice tightening. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because you accused me of making things up about Victoria," Eleanor answered gently. "And I needed you to understand the situation." Oliver's face hardened. "So, this is about that story again." "It's not a story. You expect me to believe Victoria humiliated you and then somehow forgot to mention it." Oliver asked. Eleanor remained steady. I'm telling you what happened. Oliver pushed his chair back, slightly. No, he said firmly. You're trying to turn me against her. That's not true. Yes, it is, Oliver snapped. You don't like her. You never have. Eleanor's voice softened even further. I welcomed her into our family. You've been competing with her since the beginning, Oliver continued. Victoria warned me this might happen. Eleanor felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. Warned you? Oliver exhaled impatiently. She said some mothers struggle when their sons get married, that they start creating problems. I'm not creating anything, Eleanor replied. Then why bring this up 2 weeks before the wedding? Oliver demanded. Because I thought you deserved to know the truth. Oliver stood up abruptly. This isn't the truth, he said. This is jealousy. The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Jealousy, she repeated quietly. You can't accept that I'm building my own life, Oliver continued. So, you're trying to sabotage my relationship. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. Oliver, I sold my home, so you could have the wedding she wanted. No, he replied sharply. You didn't. I did. You're lying, Oliver said. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Why would I lie about that? She asked. Because you want sympathy, Oliver answered. Because you want me to feel guilty. Eleanor stared at him in stunned silence. For a brief moment, she glimpsed the little boy who used to hug her after school, who once cried when he accidentally broke a vase and tried desperately to glue it back together. But that boy seemed very far away now. Oliver grabbed his coat from the chair. I can't deal with this right now, he said. Victoria's waiting for me. Oliver, please. I think it's better if you skip the rehearsal dinner, he interrupted. I don't want any tension before the wedding. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Eleanor remained seated long after he left. Outside the window, she watched Oliver pacing on the sidewalk while speaking urgently on his phone, no doubt explaining the conversation to Victoria. The waitress eventually returned with their drinks. Oliver's coffee sat untouched across the table. Eleanor quietly paid the bill before leaving. The drive home felt strangely empty. For years she had believed that love and sacrifice would naturally be understood. But now she realized something painful. Sometimes the more quietly a person sacrifices, the easier it becomes for others to overlook those sacrifices entirely. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her small apartment. The city lights flickered beyond her window, while the silence inside the room felt heavier than ever before. And for the first time since Oliver was born, she made a decision she never imagined possible. She would stop fighting for a place in his life. If stepping back was the only way to preserve what little relationship they still had, then she would accept it. She would attend the wedding, smile for the photographs, and then let her son go. The morning of the wedding arrived with flawless weather, as if the day itself had been arranged to match Victoria's expectations. The sky was clear, the air warm but comfortable, and the grounds of the Grand Willow estate looked immaculate. White chairs lined the garden aisle, delicate floral arches framed the ceremony space, and staff members moved quietly through the property making final adjustments to decorations. Guests began arriving early, dressed in elegant suits and pastel dresses, greeting one another with the excited energy that surrounded any grand celebration. Eleanor arrived alone. She stepped out of a modest rideshare car at the edge of the estate and paused for a moment, taking in the view of the property she had unknowingly helped finance. The large stone building stood proudly against the manicured gardens, its tall windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Everything looked exactly as Victoria had imagined. Eleanor smoothed the fabric of her pale blue dress, one she had found on clearance weeks earlier, and walked toward the ceremony entrance with quiet composure. No one had invited her to the bridal preparation suite that morning, where Victoria and her bridesmaids were having their hair styled and makeup applied by professionals. Eleanor had prepared alone in her apartment, carefully pinning her hair and applying simple makeup in the mirror above her small dresser. Inside the ceremony area, she noticed something immediately. Her seat was not in the front row. Instead, her name appeared on a place card in the third row beside several distant acquaintances. The first row was reserved entirely for members of the Langley family. Eleanor paused briefly before taking her seat. Several guests nearby greeted her warmly. "Oliver must be so proud to have you here," one woman said kindly. Eleanor smiled politely. "It's a beautiful day for them." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of music and formal words. When Oliver appeared at the front of the aisle, dressed in a tailored suit, Eleanor felt a surge of pride despite everything that had happened between them. For a brief moment, he looked exactly like the boy she had raised, nervous but hopeful, standing at the edge of an important new chapter. Victoria entered moments later in a breathtaking white gown that shimmered softly in the sunlight. The guests collectively inhaled as she walked down the aisle. Oliver smiled at her with unmistakable admiration. Eleanor watched quietly. She felt happiness for him, but also a strange sense of distance, as if she were witnessing someone else's life unfolding instead of her own. After the ceremony, the guests moved inside for the reception. The ballroom of the estate had been transformed into a glittering display of luxury. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, long tables were decorated with cascading flowers, and a live band played softly near the dance floor. Eleanor located her assigned table near the back of the room. From there she could see the main table clearly. Oliver and Victoria sat in the center, surrounded by her parents and several influential guests. No one from Oliver's side of the family sat beside him. As the evening progressed, Eleanor made polite conversation with strangers and occasionally accepted congratulations from people who assumed she must feel incredibly proud. One guest eventually approached her table, a tall young man with slightly messy hair and a familiar grin. "Mrs. Hart," he asked. Eleanor looked up. "Michael?" Michael had been Oliver's college roommate. "It's been years," he said warmly as he pulled out the chair beside her. They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes before Michael leaned slightly closer. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Eleanor blinked in mild surprise. "Why wouldn't I be?" Michael shrugged. "You just seem quieter than I expected." Eleanor gave a small smile. "Weddings can be emotional." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "You must be incredibly proud of Oliver," he continued. "He told me everything you did for him." Eleanor frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Michael looked surprised. "The house," he said. "Selling it to help pay for all this." Eleanor stared at him. "He told you that?" "Yeah," Michael replied. "A few months ago. He said he felt terrible about accepting the money." Eleanor felt a wave of confusion. "But when I mentioned it to him recently," she said slowly, "he told me I was lying." Michael's eyebrows pulled together. "That doesn't make sense." Before Eleanor could respond, the music shifted and the room grew quieter. Oliver had stood up from the main table, tapping a glass gently with a spoon. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" he said. The room gradually fell silent. Oliver looked out across the crowd, his eyes scanning the tables until they landed on Eleanor. Something in his expression had changed. His voice sounded steadier than it had in weeks. "There's someone here tonight who deserves recognition," he began. Guests turned their heads curiously. "My mother," Oliver continued. A murmur spread through the room. Eleanor froze in her seat. Oliver stepped away from the main table and walked toward her. "For most of my life," he said, "my mother has quietly sacrificed everything to give me opportunities." He gestured toward the ballroom around them. "This wedding exists because she sold the home where I grew up to help me afford it." Gasps rippled through the audience. Victoria's parents exchanged stunned looks. "My mother never asked for credit," Oliver continued. "In fact, she asked me not to tell anyone." Eleanor's chest tightened. "But I realized recently that silence sometimes hides the truth instead of protecting it," Oliver said. He turned toward her fully now. "And the truth is that I allowed someone who loves me more than anyone else in the world to be treated like an inconvenience." The room remained completely still. Oliver's voice softened.
"Mum, I'm sorry."
Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. Oliver raised his glass. "So tonight," he said, "I want everyone here to recognize the person who made my life possible." He paused. To Eleanor Hart. One by one, guests lifted their glasses. Applause slowly filled the ballroom. Eleanor felt overwhelmed as Oliver stepped forward and embraced her. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them seemed to ease. Across the room, Victoria stood frozen beside her parents, her expression stiff with embarrassment. Later that evening, she approached Eleanor privately near the hallway. "You've made quite an impression tonight," Victoria said coolly. Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "This wasn't my doing." Victoria crossed her arms. "You could have told him sooner." "I tried," Eleanor replied gently. Victoria looked away for a moment. The anger in her expression softened slightly. "Oliver loves you," she said quietly. "I know," Eleanor answered. "Then maybe we should start over," Victoria admitted reluctantly. It wasn't a warm apology, but it was a beginning. Months later, Oliver and Victoria moved to Denver as planned. The distance forced them all to redefine their relationships. Oliver called Eleanor regularly, speaking with a sincerity that had returned after the wedding. Eleanor eventually moved closer to her sister in Arizona, purchasing a small condo and rediscovering hobbies she had abandoned years earlier. For the first time in decades, her life was not centered entirely around sacrifice. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the desert sunset, Eleanor reflected on everything that had happened. She had once believed love meant giving endlessly without expecting anything in return. Now she understood something more important. True love did not require silence. It required honesty. And sometimes the greatest gift a parent could give their child was not sacrifice. It was the courage to speak the truth.